Hello and welcome to another TLDR US video, the fifth and final in our series evaluating the first term in office of President Donald J. Trump, and whether the president stuck to his 2016 promises. In this one, we'll take a look at Trump's America First ideas in foreign policy, examining promises on what we call going it alone. Basically, the US minimizing its involvement with other countries through institutions, wars, and the like. As with all the other videos in this series, we'll take a look at the initial promises, whether or not they've been successfully delivered, the potential defence for why they maybe haven't come to fruition, any future commitments the Trump campaign has made on these issues, and finally, what the Joe Biden and Democratic stance is. If you like the content we make and want to lend us a hand, then you might want to check out our merch store. You can represent the channel by putting a Countries with Shoes pin badge on your bag or jacket, now available for basically every country. Or you can just cover your stuff with stickers and magnets. Anyway, you can check out the store by clicking the link in the description. And the first 50 people get 12% off their order using code ALONE12. NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a group of 30 countries described by itself as a political and military alliance. Each member state makes a contribution to the collective budget, but this is differently weighted, with the wealthier countries paying more. For example, in 2019, after Trump was elected, but still illustrating our point, the US contributed 22% of NATO's civilian and military budget, followed by Germany, the UK, and France. And these four countries actually made up over half of the total budget. This payment structure proved to be a major gripe in Mr. Trump's 2016 campaign, in which he voiced concerns over his perceived unfairness of each member's contributions, particularly that the US was paying so much. He even suggested that under his leadership, in any military conflict, the US may not support those countries who do not pay what he saw as a fair amount. He also called the bloc obsolete and felt that the US could go it alone, with him believing that the US didn't really gain anything from being part of NATO. This rhetoric worried many, despite others such as President Macron raising their skepticism for the organisation, as collective defence is a principle that much of European and North American relations through NATO are based upon, and have been since the horrors of World War II. In contradiction, however, Trump suggested that he would work with US allies in NATO to defeat Islamic State, making his promises and how he feels about the bloc quite confusing. Another way Trump wanted to go it alone is in terms of involvement in overseas conflicts. Under previous administrations, particularly since 9/11, the US has been involved in various conflicts throughout the world. In 2016, according to The Atlantic, America had forces deployed or was carrying out drone strikes in 8 countries. And if you want to extend the definition of being involved overseas as anywhere the US is in combat, special missions, or advising and training foreign forces, then that number rises to 134 countries as of 2014. President Trump has recently called the US sticking its nose in the Middle East as the single biggest mistake in the history of our country. Sure, Trump is one for hyperbole, but that's a strong indication of his feelings. Now, for someone who wants to be less involved internationally, you can see why Trump would be irked by these facts. As president-elect, he talked about reducing the US's involvement in conflicts overseas. Nation building, a feature of US foreign policy over the years, is not something that he was too keen on. He was, however, keen on trying to bring forces home from overseas, and not engaging in wars that are not the direct business of the United States. This does tie into his negativity towards NATO, as NATO are, for example, collectively involved in Afghanistan. So those are a couple of key promises that Trump made regarding the US being more independent and less involved in the business of other states. But how did he do in living up to these promises? On NATO, Trump remained sceptical, but in 2018 decided the group was no longer obsolete, backtracking on one of his most famous campaign statements. He has also doubled down on the importance of working together in the war against terror groups such as ISIS. Despite this, President Trump has kept up the pressure on the issue of funding NATO since taking office. This pressure partially or wholly secured a change in the structure of monetary contributions, In late 2019, the Secretary General of NATO announced that members had come to an agreement which, starting in 2021, would see the US's proportion of NATO funding fall to the same as that of Germany. A great success for Trump, although we're sure he would have liked it to go further. The record on the withdrawal of troops from overseas, particularly in the Middle East, is mixed. In October 2019, Trump ordered the withdrawal of US forces from certain areas of Syria. By August of this year, there was supposed to be around 500 US service people in the country. But in September, the US actually added an extra 100 following incidents with Russian troops. In Iraq, Trump is keen to remove all military presence, bar a certain number, in order to react in the case of increased tension between Iraq and neighbouring Iran. However, as of late, there's no organised withdrawal, so that's one to keep an eye on for you. And to round it off, with regard to Afghanistan, the president has recently said that he's trying to reduce the number of US forces in the country from 8,000 plus to 4,000. This is obviously in line with what he promised on the campaign, so that's a tick. But it does come after he sent 3,000 additional troops over there in 2017. Another thing to note is that in late February 2020, the US and Taliban did agree to end the conflict and remove Allied presence from Afghanistan by mid-2021. So if all goes to plan, this would be a real success for the Trump agenda. So, all in all, in terms of troops abroad, the results are mixed, but there have been some promising signs of upholding campaign promises, particularly as described in Afghanistan. In Trump's defence, for those cases where there may be a perceived failure to live up to certain troop withdrawal promises, and we're no experts, but it can't be an easy task to withdraw hundreds, maybe thousands of troops from overseas, particularly when those areas are conflict zones. Sometimes a president can make a commitment only for the situation to change and more troops to be required. These situations are dynamic and ever-changing, and it will be somewhat unfair to criticise the president for events out of his control. Also, does withdrawing troops mean those in combat or just those stationed in a certain area? As we discussed earlier, the US has a presence in more than 100 countries, and it's unlikely that training bases, for example, would just be shut down. But what does the future hold for going it alone in Trump's 2020 campaign? Well, in this weird campaign, not a lot has been said on the issue, other than the usual long-established rhetoric. Trump spoke about NATO funding once again in his GOP convention speech, to boast about his achievements, but also to apply pressure for more defence spending from his NATO partners. Clearly referencing NATO on the Trump 2020 website, there are also promises to get allies to pay their fair share. Perhaps he'll go further though, as according to a recent New York Times article in September, there are fears that another 4 years of President Trump could actually lead to the US's withdrawal from NATO. On said website, there are also commitments to stop endless wars and bring our troops home. But in a slightly contradictory promise, they also say that they want to wipe out global terrorists who threaten to harm Americans. All in all though, this seems pretty much a continuation of past policy. Trump's 2020 opponent, former Vice President Joe Biden, as you would expect, has been critical of the president. Biden supports NATO, and speaking of troops overseas, he stated his opposition for Trump's withdrawal of troops from the Middle East, and feels that keeping a military presence in the region is key for fighting ISIS. Again, as you would expect, Biden will review Trumpian foreign policy decisions if he wins office. But are the two really that far apart on this issue? Much like Trump, Biden also does not want to be part of unnecessary wars, and definitely also wants to focus on ISIS. It may just be a case of differences in how you would define unnecessary wars, and how you go about actually defeating ISIS. So there you have it. What do you think? Has Trump fulfilled his promises on going it alone? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a video. Also, if you want to check out the other videos in this series, there's a link to the playlist in the description. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of the video, then be sure to back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.